Hey, this is Sharif here with another episode of the Golden Hour, joined by Dr. Kevin Majors. Kevin, good to be here with you again.
Hey, Sharif. Thanks for having me back.
Absolutely. Well, Kevin, I want to talk today about being overwhelmed. We've recently been getting more inquiries from people who are overwhelmed and how to deal with this. And I think it's an interesting phenomenon because it combines the psychology, which is our specialty, how to help people to deal with the challenges that they're facing. But then also there is an external reality that they have to deal with. So I kind of wanted to talk to you about how to grapple with both of those things at the same time. So how do you approach this question? When people come to you and they're overwhelmed, how do you help them?
Yeah, it is a common thing, and it seems like it in the during the pandemic, things it has gotten more common that people were working from home, working at all hours of the day and night, and so they felt like work filled up all of their life. And it just the normal thing I see in people who are overwhelmed is this sense that they're trapped in a situation that they can't control. So there's something about the structure, the whatever kind of work that they're doing, that there is nothing they can do. They feel like that the demands just keep coming, and they're trying to survive, but they're definitely not thriving in their work. So the kind of difficult maneuver that you need to do when people are like that is to help them to see the opportunity for their own growth that this is giving them. Because I think when people are overwhelmed, they just see it in terms of externals and situations, and they see it in terms of things that are permanent. That these things, this is just the way it is. How do I do it? And then they imagine a better life somewhere else. So they think that, oh, if only I didn't have to, like, if only if I had my own business, if only I had, you know, and I could have my own low expectations for myself, and then I would never be overwhelmed, and I could just be doing whatever I wanted. They have these dreams that there's some alternate life. I don't think those dreams though are helpful. Uh, so the dangerous thing you could say about being overwhelmed is that you don't see what you can do differently because you're just trying to survive. But the solution really depends on you taking charge of what you can control, which is yourself, your attitude, your outlook, the way that you're viewing the situation. And I think that there's a real depth of psychology that you need to get into with people gently, because you don't want someone who feels overwhelmed to feel now that you're blaming them, like this is, oh, you could do it totally differently. No, but there are ways that they can change their outlook that could make all the difference in the world. And I think psychology just has a lot to say about what changes need to take place.
Interesting. So now it seems like you can take positions kind of at different places along, say, a spectrum. Say one side is totally externalizing the challenge. I just need to change whatever's going on. Like I need to quit my job, or I need to take whatever it is. Uh, and then at the other end of the spectrum, you could have it's totally internal. You just have to change your internal relationship to the challenge. Are you suggesting that we go at the other extreme, or is there kind of a middle point where you actually do have to address the externals, or are you suggesting that addressing the externals effectively comes from having changed your mindset? I just wonder if you could kind of
Yeah,
fill that
that's a
out a
great
bit.
question. Yeah, and in my experience, you don't really know what the real objective situation is externally
Mhm.
until you address the internal. Because when I'm trying to help someone, I'm getting their whole life filtered through the lens of their current state. So I know that for that to be most accurate, there's some tuning of the vision that you want to take place. So, and typically once you can shift people out of the overwhelmed state, yeah, and there's a number of elements that go into that. Once they're shifted out of it and they start seeing possibilities, then I, as the person helping them, I'm not going to be forgetting that there might be external things that really do need to be addressed. Because it can happen that you shift someone's view so completely, that wow, then now they actually feel great. Their energy's back. They have a zeal for the work that they're doing, and it still could objectively be too much. But so normally what I do is I first focus on what you can do internally because that's what they actually have more control over. Once their outlook has changed, then you can shift to be thinking now what are the real problems that do need to be addressed here? Because we never want to use reframing and mindfulness challenge just as a way of helping people to get by in a situation that does need to change. But many times when people are overwhelmed, it's because they're living in threat mode. They're seeing all of these threats, all these demands that may not really be so onerous or as real as they're saying. They can tend to be seeing obligations where obligations don't really exist. Or they could think that they have to spend 3 hours preparing this thing or 10 hours preparing this thing. But they don't see that actually they could be more flexible in how they do it, and it could take much less time. So it's very tough to know, when a person is in that kind of lockdown, overwhelmed state. And sometimes people can feel paralyzed by it. It's tough to know what the objectives are until you first address the internal. But you can't forget about both. So in a sense, the answer is both. But I do first internal and then focus on the external.
Yeah, but I really like this point that if you're overwhelmed, that puts you in threat mode, which we talk about quite a bit. And then when you're in threat mode, it's hard for you to objectively assess the situation. And so you might exaggerate how many things you have to do, how soon you have to do them. There's also this thing we've talked about in an earlier episode of the illusion of simultaneity, is thinking that you have to do all these things today when actually they're spread out over several days or even weeks, since you actually have plenty of time if you just prioritize effectively.
Exactly. I think, and you say with threat mode, people get, when we're in threat mode, we are not supposed to be operating in a kind of flexible, creative way. The idea of threat mode is you just need to survive. So, what you need to do is get through this situation, but you're not going to be updating your model of the situation or yourself. So, what that means is threat mode makes people more fixed in the way they view the situation, in the way they view the challenges they're facing, the way they view their abilities. Everything just becomes locked in. And then they feel like they need to somehow, like, fitting pieces of puzzle together, they have to somehow make it all work. And so their brain is running overtime, but they've lost this essential kind of flexibility. And that is such a hallmark of people who are overwhelmed, is that there's a fixation in the way they view themselves and the demands being placed on them from outside. And this ties into a deeper thing that when you're talking about uh, there's like part of threat mode is inherently pessimistic. And I use that in the sense of what Martin Seligman talks about, in his research, the early stuff, especially on learned optimism, where he's talking about what optimism means and what pessimism means. So when people, now this is just a slight detour, but I think it's relevant. Optimism and pessimism are about attribution of causality. So if something happens and say it didn't turn out well, like a kid fails a math test, and you ask him, "Why did you fail?" Then what does he attribute it to? Does he say, "Oh, I just didn't study enough," which means it's something could be different next time. It's inherently flexible. Or does he say, "I'm just not good at math," or "the class is just too hard"? Well, that's not going to be different next week. So once you start attributing it to a permanent thing in yourself or your situation, you become fixed in it. And that's what pessimism is. So pessimism means you tend to see everything as being fixed, and therefore it's negative. So it goes with threat mode. So once a person is in threat mode, they're going to tend toward this pessimism. And without realizing it, they're going to see themselves in the situation as somehow inflexible. And that's especially then what you need to work on.
That's great. So that's one psychological skill, is this learned optimism. Are there any other psychological skills that we can develop to help us in this moment when we're starting to feel overwhelmed?
Probably another one is the stuff about internal versus external locus of control. So this goes back to Roder in 1966 coming up with a locus of control scale, And it has all these questions in it about how do people feel that their life is determined by their own actions or by forces outside of themselves? And it's still used. It's a widely used scale. And actually, I have here. I'll read you a couple uh, examples of questions from the locus of control scale. One is, which of these is more true? It's hard to know whether or not a person really likes you, or how many friends you have depends on how nice a person you are. So you'd ask, now what's hidden in that is that one of them, is outside of your control. Like it's really hard to tell if people like you or not. Like there's nothing you can do. Versus how many friends you have depends on how nice you are, or however, or how it depends on your social skills. You could say, well, that actually has a lot more, a sense of internal control. Another one is becoming a success is a matter of hard work. Luck has little or nothing to do with it. Versus getting a good job depends mainly on being in the right place at the right time. So people can ask themselves, well, which of those would I tend to go by? So I think that's probably enough for the questions. But the idea here is that what we're what you're seeing, and there's a lot of research on locus of control that shows how much it correlates with things like it's called neuroticism. Technically, I call it complaining because that's the essence of neuroticism is a habit of complaining. How much it goes with problems with your view of self, low self esteem, and the sense of lack of self efficacy. So these things all go together. Yeah, and so having an internal locus of control means that you're looking for what can I do differently here. And yes, the situation may be hard, but given that, still I can make a difference, and my efforts can make a difference. That's moving, I think, powerfully in the right direction.
That's great. Yeah, and those questions, how would you see those applying to the situation of being overwhelmed? I mean, it seems like what you're proposing is that there are two ways of looking at being overwhelmed. One is the external locus of control, which would be something like, I don't know, there's too much to get done, or there's more work than I can possibly do in this amount of time. Whereas you're suggesting to have an internal locus of control to say something like, well, the amount that I accomplish depends on how much I can prioritize and strategize. And
Yeah, and those are two different mindsets, two different states, and really it correlates with being in threat mode or being in opportunity mode. So if you have an external locus of control, it's going to take an environment with very low demands for you not to be in threat mode. But if you have a very strong internal locus of control, you're going to feel much more like you're in this opportunity mode in even high demanding environments. So you can, and I should say that there's a lot of impact on your ability to perform depending on whether or not you're in threat mode. And there's more and more research being done that shows that when you're in threat mode, your ability to solve problems is decreased. It's like your intelligence decreases because you're only meant to survive in threat mode. You're not meant to thrive in it. So if you're stuck in that mode, then you're going to be, you know, less able to perform. And then you get into a vicious cycle where that only then makes you feel like you're more in threat mode.
yeah, that's right. So being in threat mode, you're more likely to get distracted, you're more likely to be multitasking, and that causes you to be less and less productive, which makes you get further and further behind. So you're more in threat mode. So it's, yeah.
And then you're going to be more and more likely to attribute it to externals
Hmm.
because threat mode always is, the sense of like your model gets fixed so that you can operate quickly and safely within it to escape. That's the whole idea of threat mode. It is powerful in shaping our attention and it makes us feel overwhelmed. So I think that these things all go together, being pessimistic, attributing everything to things that can't change, having the external locus of control, being in threat mode. So they really do tie together. And another element of it, which is something we focus much more on in optimal work, is the sense of passive challenge or active challenge. Now, this correlates very much with where, like, does the challenge feel that it's located? Does it feel like it's outside of you, which is external locus, or does it feel like it's coming from within? But there's another element, which is that you can just determine by your choices in the next minutes and the next hour whether or not you are setting a positive challenge for yourself versus you're still persisting in being challenged and just getting things done. So it just highlights much more the sense because even external and internal locus of control could feel like personality traits. That this is just the way some people are and that it correlates with these other negative traits. But I think even things like neuroticism are highly shapeable. You can change people's habit of complaining. So I think all those things are actually very adjustable. You can work on it and get better. And so, but what I like about talking about passive versus active challenges, you can do it right now. And that's actually the fastest way to escape feeling overwhelmed with whatever the challenge, the main task is that you're having a hard time with, or that seems like the greatest burden. In that task, set a specific challenge that you can engage right now so that you stretch yourself in it in the next 15 minutes or the next hour. Once people regain the sense of actively challenging themselves, in that moment, actually, they don't feel overwhelmed because the locus of control has moved inward.
Now, Kevin, when you're telling people this, that when they're overwhelmed, they have to challenge themselves even more. I mean, it seems like kind of a tough thing to say to people. Do you ever get pushback when you tell people that?
Yeah, and that is probably the most challenging thing about helping people with this. It's practically overwhelming that you don't want to be triggering in them the sense of guilt or shame or like you're telling them, oh, you're just not trying hard enough. What I'm definitely not trying to share with them is the message you need to try harder. Which I think if you just tell people, look, you need active challenge back in your life, I think that could be tough. So what's probably then the most important starting point, is to get them thinking about what would they most want to be like, in engaging this one particular challenge. Because it might be that they feel overwhelmed by multiple challenges, and so they're thinking, oh, there's just so much going on. And it's hard to focus on any one thing. When people get really stuck in threat mode, they can feel like they're not even able to like actively engage one thing in their life. So like when they're with, their clients, they're not really present. When they're writing up proposals, they're not really present. When they're with their family, they're not really present because they're always just doing this mix of things in their head. And so in some sense, the multitasking internally at least never stops. It's just constant sense of having to be juggling all these things. So what I would want them to do is to have a sense of, okay, what if you only had one thing to do? And take this one thing, this thing that right now feels especially overwhelming. Say it's giving some presentation. Well, if you had all the time in the world and all the expertise, what would you want it to look like? Okay, and to get a sense of like what they would look like thriving in that challenge. Okay, then you're helping them get towards this good, thriving, being confident, being skillful, having real mastery. What would that look like? Okay, then you can just take one element of that kind of mastery, one little aspect of the image and say, okay, let's just plan now. What would that look like really getting good at that? Or how would you use this right now to improve in it? So you try to get them to have a more positive view of just one thing, and with that, you start flipping things around. So you're starting to get them to see, okay, there is a good I can aim for. And as soon as they start making the internal switch, it's okay, I could stretch myself in this way, the overwhelmed feeling does start to subside. That's the beauty about active passive challenge, that dichotomy, is that when you move it from being passively challenged to finding a way to set an active one, you do experience a lifting of the overwhelmed sensation. And then it gives you the wiggle room you need to help them to think even more. And then once they start feeling it and they start getting a little bit of sense of possibility returning, sense of opportunity, then you can kind of keep reinforcing it that this is not pushing harder. It's not trying harder. It's just crafting one little aspect of the challenge you're facing. There is something really healing about just focusing on doing one little thing as well as you can. So you just, and I think that is a great kind of calisthenic, that just take care of one little detail really well. You stretch yourself on just having a little bit of order in your desk, in having things somehow especially well prepared. You take care of the small details in your work and you stretch yourself in those small details. That actually does return this internal locus of control. It returns optimism, and the sense of active challenge. And the feeling of being overwhelmed starts to lift.
Now, Kevin, okay, let me ask a follow-up question here, which is that when we feel overwhelmed, one of the things you just talked about was when you start to actively challenge yourself, the feeling of overwhelmed starts to lift, starts to go away. But when we're talking about anxiety and adrenaline, one of the things we talk about there is that you want to embrace the challenge. You want to be able to say, bring it on, but you want to be able to say, bring it on precisely to the kind of internal, the sensation, the feeling of the adrenaline. Uh, so it seems to me that when people are overwhelmed, they shouldn't see that as a bad thing, like, and they want to get the feeling to go away, but they should see it as actually this is you just listed like in this episode over the course of it 20 or so like really good things that people can grow in when they're overwhelmed. It gives them a unique opportunity to practice learned optimism, growth mindset, prioritization, strategization, strategizing, growing in mastery, like all these things. And being overwhelmed, that situation gives people a really unique opportunity to grow in all of these areas. So when people are overwhelmed, should they be saying, bring it on?
That's a really good point. So, is being overwhelmed a sensation? So, and I would say it's not. So, people describe it as a feeling, but I think that it's more a judgment they're making. That somehow this situation is too much for me to handle. So, I think that there's really just a judgment about it, and it's a statement of being in threat mode. So, what are the emotions that go with being overwhelmed? Probably primarily it's things like being irritable or angry or anxious. And those, if those become the primary thing that now they're getting overwhelmed by that emotion, so like, they're just getting overwhelmed by feelings of anger, then yes, you'd focus on the mindfulness of the anger or mindfulness of the anxiety. So you would want to work with that, I think, like, and if the emotional component is big, but usually I just take feeling overwhelmed as a kind of common parlance, and what they're really saying is a judgment about their situation that's fixed. So that's typically the way that um, but should they say bring it on? Well, yes, absolutely. Once they have a sense of a positive goal, because in a way, there's, the you could think of it. We've recently been talking about dopamine. So, in the book, The Molecule of More, by Lieberman. So I think that also provided, once you have a positive goal, dopamine starts to kick back in, and you have like, if you have some kind of particular stretch going forward, with that stretch, you get dopamine. A positive stretch you set for yourself gives you dopamine on demand. And I think that is what actually shifts everything and makes them not feel overwhelmed anymore. They're just experiencing dopamine coming back. And dopamine does, in fact, turn down the negative aspects of adrenaline, the threat mode part of it, while retaining the noradrenaline in the brain. The sense of like, because it works with noradrenaline in the brain so that you can perform at your best. So I think then you can get the best of both worlds and you can flip from being in a kind of depressed, burdened state to actually having a lot of energy that now can be directed. So you do get a bounce. In that sense, yes, the core of it would be able to say to a positive goal, bring it on. I'm going to stretch myself towards this.
Awesome. Okay, Kevin, I just have one last question, which is if, say, a friend comes to you and they're overwhelmed, I think it's common that you want to be compassionate. It's like we always talk about, okay, what ideal are you going to live? And maybe if someone comes to you overwhelmed, you think, okay, maybe now's a good opportunity to be compassionate or to be understanding. So how do you kind of draw a line, or that you also want to help them engage the challenge? So where do you draw the line between being understanding and compassionate, and that's a good thing, versus kind of trying to complain with them or help them to reduce the challenge, or these things? I don't know if I'm clearly communicating my question, but
No, it's a very clear question.
okay.
I wish I could have a clear answer.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, I think that sometimes if a person feels understood, it's enough for them to start thinking positively about how they can challenge themselves. So, but if this is something where the person is seeking reassurance and you think that they don't really need reassurance, then you don't want to give them the reassurance. So I don't think you help people who are overwhelmed by reassuring them that they're good enough because you're still in the fixed mindset. So there's still, it's like you're trying to say, well, the quantity of X that you have is sufficient for this situation Y, which is kind of what all reassurance comes down to, is just reinforcing people in a fixed mindset and a fixed view of themselves in the situation. So the question is, how do you get flexibility back? Well, having another perspective on it can start to reintroduce that flexibility. But I think that you just need to know the person. Just the experience of the bond of the friendship might be enough to start lifting them out of that state. And so there's a lot that goes on when we're feeling overwhelmed and we're stuck in a very, you could say, left brain view of things, and the right brain bond is enough to start returning kind of the processing back to where it needs to be so that they can actually be flexible. So, but if you can start gently just talking about what are possible options that they have, and get them to think about options, get them to think about possibilities. Already, then you're introducing some flexibility, and that might be this like a good safe way to go. Uh, but the more people practice on their own dealing with being overwhelmed, the better they get at it. Then they can also provide their own kind of sharing experience of, hey, this is kind of what I learned to do. I wonder if this would work for you. You kind of be curious and propose things. So possibilities, curiosity, I think all of that starts to work to lift people out of the fixed view of everything to something that's a little more reality based.
Great, Kevin. That's super helpful. Thanks so much. So we are now out of time. Uh, where these episodes get longer and longer. But do you have any final thoughts you want to leave us with?
I guess my only final thought would be that uh, the when a person feels overwhelmed, their view of the situation is fixed, but their view of themselves is also fixed. So the more you start working on thinking about your ideals, and what you really want, how you want to be growing in the most positive way, what the most kind of valiant, version of yourself would look like. You can start to see that, in fact, there are ways of living those ideals in any moment. And that's the beauty of ideals, just putting the thing at the end and having a view of yourself and a view of your own full growth in ideals. And to see, okay, maybe this is an especially good time to grow in my ideals. So that there's a whole nother topic, but I think it just rounds out the picture, that the sense of growth and possibilities.
Yeah, and if I may just add, and just basically, I'm just going to put that a slightly different way, which is that their view of the situation is fixed, and their view of themselves is fixed, and also their goal or what they're seeking is fixed. So, I mean, you're also suggesting, hey, maybe you need to change what you're striving for, and to, instead of strive for the outcome of less work or getting this work done, you want to actually strive for yourself living this ideal.
Yeah, exactly. If it's not a goal that you feel you can attain, then, well, what is the goal you can attain? And maybe it's a much better goal. And maybe there are much more important ways of growing than just succeeding in this other limited way. That's a great point.
Awesome. Great. Well, thanks so much, Kevin. We'll be back
Thank you, Sharif.
next week.